for the people who have passed through Pepe in the recent years have definitely met our excitement towards rebuilding and nourishing the biodiversity all around our vineyards. And this is something that we've paid a particular attention, especially when we started our 5-year rotation plans of culture all around our vineyards. So when grandfather started, it was really concentrated on vine growing. He did an incredible job, but we've been trying to detach from the so-called monoculture in order to replicate what was the history of our territory and what the people were doing back then. And the idea was to have a farm that could sustain and eat on everything that the farm was producing, and that was only possible by having the different culture on the property of the farm. That's the reason why we've been starting to grow many different cultures, and we've been trying to get all the land surrounding our vineyard to have at least one different culture going next to one of our vineyards. So grandfather always had olive trees surrounding his plots, and that's why when you come around here you can clearly recognize all of them because they're surrounded by olive trees. But we have planted in the past few years more than 10 different cultures, which they rotate every year, and they kind of sustain our soils and they enrich through their different root system that each culture has, but they also nourish the family because we've been growing wheat and we've been growing chickpeas, we've been growing fava beans, sunflowers, barley, spelt. We've been growing just a lot of stuff. In this journey of building biodiversity all around our vineyards, we've been accompanied by two of the institutions of wheat here in Italy, which are Professore Salvatore Ceccarelli and Stefania Grando, which have been studying wheat all their life, and I've asked them to come in the wheat field today with us to go a little bit deeper into wheat genetics and breeding and history, and so to help us understand a little bit more. Stefania, Salvatore, thanks for being here with us in our field of evolutionary population. So where do we start? Tell us more.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having us. For us, it's always a great pleasure to sit in a field where there is one of our evolutionary populations. Evolutionary populations are nothing else than crops where plants are completely different from each other, and in this way they drastically differ from modern varieties. And growing evolutionary population, as you can see, Stefania is showing different spikes. Growing evolutionary population is one way of implementing the concept of biodiversity in agriculture. In agriculture, we can use diversity in different ways by growing different crops, different varieties within the same crop, or varieties which are not uniform, as in the case of this field. And the extraordinary diversity between plants within the same crop is the major advantage of evolutionary populations, because the competition between plants make this crop particularly tall, much taller than modern variety, and in this way they are able to control much better and without chemicals diseases, insects and weeds, and therefore they are particularly suited to organic and biodynamic agriculture, because by nature they do not require chemicals. In addition, all this diversity that you can see above ground most probably exists also below ground. So the root system of an evolutionary population is probably exploring a much wider area of the soil, and therefore is able to tap water reserves much deeper than what a modern variety can do. And therefore, one of the major advantages of populations might actually come out in a dry year like this. So we are expecting that in Italy this year evolutionary populations grown under organic conditions will yield as much as or even more than modern varieties. All these reflects in advantages also in terms of resilience towards climate changes, because naturally in a crop like this there will be some crosses between plants, and because plants are completely different, the seed that the Pepe family will harvest from this field is not genetically the same of the seed which has been planted. In other words, this population evolve. Next year will be slightly different, and this evolution is actually it happens according to the climate, and therefore slowly these populations becomes better adapted not only to the temperature and rainfall as they change, but these two changes also bring with them changes in diseases, insects and weeds. And it doesn't matter what happens, because this population, as much as it contains and maintains all this diversity, will be able to continue to evolve no matter what the future climate is. As I mentioned that there are also advantages from a nutritional point of view, because we have, in a country where we always have bread and pasta on the table, how can we diversify our diet as it is recommended by medical doctors? Well, in a country where you always eat bread and pasta, one solution is to actually embed biodiversity into the loaf of bread and the dish of pasta. But there are also, of course, other ways of enriching the diet, and I will let Stefania to say a few words on this.
Well, another way to bring back diversity into our diets and in the fields is actually to go back and grow crops almost forgotten. So we can add to wheat, and durum wheat and to bread wheat we can add, for example, forgotten crop like barley, we are still growing barley in Italy, also in this area, but it's mainly grown as animal feed. Barley is also an important food crop, so we could start diversifying our diet, bringing back, for example, barley in the field and in our diets. Another forgotten crop that could be extremely interesting, because it's a summer crop, so it can be grown instead of maize, is millet. Millet requires much less water than maize. It has many more nutrients in the grain, so it could be cultivated, it could come back into our diet as a very nutritious crop, and in doing so and developing a value chain where everybody gets whatever is required, also farmers can actually make a living out of growing some of those crops. In other words, I like to talk about barley and millet as smart food. Crops that are giving us food that are good for us, good for the environment, because also require, as I say, less water, but also require much less fertilizer, and are good for the farmers who are growing them.
So Salvatore, another very interesting part for me was, where did the evolutionary population started? How did you manage to make all this and have the intuition of finding the mixture of the future?
Well, this particular population was born in Syria in 2009, so about 11 years ago, and arrived in Italy in 2010. And ever since has been spreading all over Italy, and now is grown in almost every region. Why this idea? Well, the idea itself is not entirely new, because the first paper, the first scientific papers demonstrating the advantages of growing what are now defined as heterogeneous crops, so crops where the plants are all different, dates back in 1929. So it's a very old idea. And after that original paper, there has been an enormous amount of scientific demonstrations of the advantages of growing evolutionary populations and mixtures. These advantages, as I mentioned before, are a better control of diseases, insects, a continuous evolution towards a higher yield, and last but not least, an incredible yield stability over seasons. So the ability to absorb and to buffer the vagaries of climate from one year to another. We have done a particular type of plant breeding for many years, which is called participatory plant breeding. Starting in 1995, we start exploring this possibility of doing research in collaboration with farmers. We started in Syria, and then we moved to Tunisia and Morocco, and then to Jordan, basically all the countries of North Africa, the Horn of Africa, Iran, Yemen, and was very successful. Was very successful at the level of farmers, much less so at the level of institutions. Institutions start believing that transferring all this decisional power to farmer was not acceptable, and therefore we start having difficulties in continuing this particular work. But by that time, we are talking about 2008, 2009, we have built a very nice networks of hundreds and hundreds of farmers in a dozen of countries where they knew how to handle diversity. So we thought, together with Stefania, said, why don't we give them all the diversity in the same bunch of seed? And once they have all this diversity, they will decide whether to grow it as such or to select the best spikes and make a new variety which is perfectly adapted to their own field. It was when we sent our first evolutionary population to Iran that we discovered an Iranian woman decided to make bread out of the evolutionary population of bread wheat, and they discovered that this was very well accepted by customers who were saying that this was very digestible, good, they felt much better. Yeah. And when these populations came to Italy and some bakeries start transforming the grain of the evolutionary population into bread, we discovered the same advantages. And today, particularly in this area, in the south of Marche and north of Abruzzo, there are several bakeries, several millers, some restaurants were using the flour of evolutionary population.
So how many spikes or years are we expecting to see today? Like here there are a bunch and they're all totally different. Yeah. Well, so the grain is different, the length, the quantity.
Consider, Chiara, that at the beginning there were 2,000 in this particular population.
Fantastic.
In the durum wheat population there were 700. Okay. In the barley evolutionary population 1,600.
Crazy.
And well, I would like to mention that one of the reasons why sometimes you find products with the label of mixture of Aleppo is because many people, when they are transforming, they like to remember the place where this population originally came from. Right. And of course, with time, you don't have any more 2,000, but you may have more or less. And this ability of the evolutionary population to adapt brings with it another interesting issue, that the farmers is no more interested in buying seed from the seed market, because as this population evolves, it becomes perfectly adapted not only to the climate and the soil of this particular farm, but also to the way in which, and Chiara was mentioning this, how this population enters into the philosophy, into the management of the entire farm. Once this population is so well adapted to this farm, there is no need to try to buy other seed, because biologically speaking, there cannot be better seed than this.
Yes, and you have a certain independence as being a farmer that makes you like totally happy because you have your richness right there.
Yeah, exactly.
And you can just, everything auto selects, and whatever matches the conditions that specific wheat finds in the soil, then it will just come up. And it means that there is a perfect combination of terroir and whatever you're planting on. So every ear is so different from one another, different heights, different shape. Why is that like this?
Well, let's take an example. You see this year, for example, look at these two plants. This plant obviously was much happier this year on this soil with this particular temperature and rainfall pattern than this one. So these will produce less seed than this, and to put it in a human perspective, this plant will have less children than this one.
Yes.
So the children of these plants will be much less than these, and
yes.
Plants like these next year should be many more.
Right.
But next year, the climate may be actually in favor of the children of these
little
plant.
ones.
And so they will become.
Trick.
So the population is moving left
right.
and right,
yeah.
and this is why what I mentioned before. One of the most interesting attributes from the point of view of the farmers is the stability. Well, Stefania was pointing, look at this head, for example, with no horns. You see all this diversity? If this diversity has a meaning in terms of adaptation, these plants, the frequency of plants of this type will vary from one year to another. But look at the wisdom of natural selection. This plant is obviously much less happy than this one, but does not disappear.
Right.
Natural selection is much more tolerant. Before something disappears from this population, it must have a major disadvantage. So the disappearance is something which might happen, but it takes a number of years which are always against this particular plant. And we all know that the climate is completely different from one year to the next, so the probability that something disappears is actually very remote.
Amazing.
And in addition to that, as I mentioned before, there could be occasional crosses between this plant and this plant, and because these are different, like it happens in human, you see a family with a lot of children, the children are completely different.
Yeah.
So you may have new diversity which was not present in the original 2000.
Wow.
So after some time you may have in this field plants which were not in the original population, that are completely new, and this is basically the outcome of natural selection.
It happens in evolution of vines as well, when you have very historical clones that are never been selected and made them thus stronger by, nurseries, is that they have a certain ability to change and adapt. And the original selection or genetics that was first grafted probably is not the same that we have today, because as slowly adapted. But clearly this adaptation and this possibility of genetical change does not happen when you select a species, make it stronger and plant, like wheat with hybrids. And Salvatore, you know what? On this field next year, it will be planted a plot of vineyard, and we were particularly interested in planting the miscuglio right here to improve the quality of the soil, just because different varietals of wheat with their root system could contribute differently to the soil. So how does the roots of wheat contribute and impacts the quality of soil?
We actually do not know, but we have an hypothesis and we have a project to test this hypothesis. The hypothesis is that because all this diversity that we see above ground is probably existing also below ground, in addition to obvious agronomic advantages such as better resistance to drought, because if you have roots at different depth, there is a better use of the water reserves in the soil. The hypothesis, which has been put forward by a microbiologist at the University of Perugia, and we are going to test with this project, if approved, is that all this diversity of roots is actually increasing the diversity of the macrofauna and microflora in the soil, which are essential for a healthy soil, which with time becomes even more productive. There are already some scientific evidence that the presence of life in the soil is one of the most important consequences of organic and biodynamic agriculture. There are studies on the microfauna of the soil showing that if you move from organic to biodynamic, there are no major differences. But if you move from these two types of agriculture to conventional agriculture with manure or conventional agriculture with only synthetic chemicals, there is a drastic reduction in the life of the soil. Now, all these beneficial effects that organic and biodynamic agriculture have can be further enhanced by growing evolutionary population because of the heterogeneity of the root system.
Amazing. I'm so happy just to know this. In this field, we've clearly planted, and then we've used one of the preparation that it's used in the biodynamic agriculture. So we sprayed 500, which is cow manure in the horn, and we all know what it is. But the idea was to strengthen the growth of the wheat and make them stronger during the ripening season. So,
in fact, if I may interrupt you, many fields at this stage, because of the height, which is one of the attributes by which evolutionary population control weeds, most of these fields are actually going down. They lodge because of the height, and this field is surprisingly standing up very well compared with others.
Amazing.
Well done.
So Stefania and Salvatore, I can't thank you enough for enriching our knowledge with everything that you've learned all your life and brought back to Italy, and enriching our loaves of bread and anything that we cook with the flour and the pasta that we receive out of this. Grazie.
Most welcome, and you know that for us it's always a pleasure to come to your farm, also because very often you fed us with this bread and this pasta.
Right. See, we don't have it now, but next time.
No. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting us.
Grazie, grazie. Thank you so much.